The Permian Ocean was one of the most complex worlds life had ever built. Across the seafloor, dense beds of brachiopods stretched through the shallows. Crinoids rose like underwater meadows, while vast reef systems were constructed by corals that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. Above them swam creatures just as strange. Helicoprion carried a spiral of teeth embedded within its lower jaw, an arrangement so unusual that scientists spent more than a century trying to understand where those teeth belonged. This was an ocean shaped by hundreds of millions of years of evolution. It had endured ice ages, shifting continents, and previous mass extinctions. Then something began beneath Siberia. It did not arrive from space, and there was no single moment of impact. The Earth itself began releasing what would become one of the most destructive chains of environmental change in its history. By the time it was over, more than two-thirds of marine animal genera had disappeared, while species-level estimates climbed dramatically higher. Trilobites, survivors of previous mass extinctions, and more than 250 million years of planetary change, vanished completely. Entire reef-building systems collapsed, and for millions of years afterward, the ocean struggled to rebuild what had been lost. The catastrophe became known as the Great Dying, but the destruction did not come from lava alone. The real story leads from volcanic rock beneath Siberia into a changing atmosphere, rising temperatures, acidifying seas, and vast regions of ocean slowly losing the oxygen animals needed to survive. If you enjoy this kind of content, a like and subscribe helps more people find it. And I'm curious, what brought you here tonight? Can't sleep? Or just love this kind of thing? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's go back to the Permian Ocean before the dying began, when the ancient world beneath the surface was still crowded with life. By the late Permian, Earth had already lived through almost the entire Paleozoic era, an immense chapter of biological history that began more than 500 million years ago. The Permian itself stretched from roughly 299 million to 252 million years ago. By its closing stages, marine ecosystems carried the accumulated results of evolutionary experiments, reaching back to the earliest flourishing of complex animal life. The continents had also completed an extraordinary rearrangement. Nearly every major landmass had joined into Pangaea, forming a single enormous supercontinent extending across much of the globe. Around it spread Panthalassa, a superocean occupying most of Earth's surface. Its name means all sea, an appropriate description for a body of water so vast that crossing it would have meant traveling through an ocean larger than the modern Pacific. Along the eastern margins of Pangaea lay another important marine realm. The Tethys Sea extended between great portions of the assembled continents, creating broad regions of warm, shallow water. Continental shelves provided sunlight, nutrients, and extensive seafloor habitat, allowing marine communities to flourish in extraordinary abundance. Much of the Permian Ocean's biological richness was concentrated within environments like these, where depth, temperature, and available nutrients created countless opportunities for life. Across the bottom lived animals whose importance would seem unfamiliar in a modern sea. Among the most successful were brachiopods. Their paired shells could make them resemble clams at first glance, yet the resemblance concealed a very distant relationship. Brachiopods belong to an entirely separate branch of animal life. For roughly 300 million years, they had occupied marine environments in immense numbers, fastening themselves to substrates or resting across the bottom while filtering suspended food from the surrounding water. Rising among them were crinoids, relatives of modern sea stars, and sea urchins, often called sea lilies because of their flower-like appearance. Many anchored themselves to the bottom on long stalks. Their crowns opened into feathery arms that collected particles drifting past in the current. Some Permian forms could rise more than 6 feet above the substrate, adding height to communities that extended from the sediment into the water column. Reefs added another dimension. Their principal coral architects belong to groups called rugose corals and tabulate corals. Rugose forms included solitary animals with horn-like skeletons, as well as colonial species, while tabulate corals constructed tightly connected colonies. Both represented ancient experiments in reef building. Neither lineage survives in the present ocean. Together, these organisms formed parts of a mature biological network. Microscopic phytoplankton captured energy near the illuminated surface. Zooplankton consumed smaller organisms and drifting organic material. Filter feeders extracted suspended particles from moving water, while predatory invertebrates hunted among shells, stems, crevices, and sediment. Fish occupied increasingly varied roles above them, and larger predators moved through the upper levels of the food web. Energy passed through this system along pathways refined by hundreds of millions of years of competition, adaptation, and ecological change. Paleontologists often describe the deeper transformation of marine history by distinguishing between two broad evolutionary assemblages. One is known as the Paleozoic fauna, dominated by groups such as brachiopods, crinoids, and ancient corals. The other is the modern fauna, containing many lineages that would become increasingly familiar in later seas. These were not simply collections of different species. They represented different arrangements of ecological power, different animals occupying the most abundant positions and shaping the physical structure of marine communities. Near the end of the Permian, the older configuration still held much of the ocean in its grasp. Its inhabitants had inherited a world assembled across an almost unimaginable span of evolutionary time. Each lineage fitted into relationships older than many mountains. For the moment, that ancient arrangement remained intact. For more than a century, one of the Permian Ocean's largest predators was known to science almost entirely from a circle of teeth. Helicoprion belonged to the Eugenodontida, an extinct order of cartilaginous fishes distantly related to the evolutionary branch containing sharks and chimeras. Its skeleton was made largely of cartilage rather than dense bone, leaving little behind after death. Estimates of its full size remain uncertain, but large individuals may have approached 23 to 26 feet in length. Fossils attributed to the genus have been discovered across widely separated regions, including Idaho, Russia, Japan, and Australia, revealing an animal distributed through seas spanning much of the ancient world. What survived most readily was the structure that made Helicoprion unlike almost any other known vertebrate. Its teeth formed a continuous spiral called a tooth whorl. New teeth developed along the outer portion, while older teeth were carried inward, creating a tightly coiled arrangement that could contain scores of individual crowns. In exceptional specimens, the whorl reached roughly 18 inches across, preserving a sequence accumulated throughout much of the animal's life. When these fossils attracted scientific attention during the late 19th century, their anatomy presented an unusual problem. A spiral of teeth could be preserved beautifully, yet the cartilage that once supported it usually vanished. Paleontologists therefore had the weapon but almost none of the machinery around it. The result was more than 100 years of imaginative reconstruction. Some researchers placed the spiral at the front of the snout, exposed like a circular cutting blade. Others positioned it elsewhere on the head or body. Illustrations showed the whorl projecting outward, curling beneath the jaw, or occupying arrangements that now appear anatomically improbable. Each reconstruction attempted to explain a fossil for which the most useful surrounding evidence had disappeared. A particularly important specimen from Idaho eventually changed that picture. Preserved within a block of limestone, the fossil contains subtle traces that earlier methods could not fully resolve. In 2013, researchers used computed tomography scanning to examine its internal structure without destroying the specimen. The resulting images revealed impressions of cartilage associated with the jaws and skull, allowing the tooth whorl to be placed with far greater confidence. The spiral belonged inside the lower jaw. Rather than spinning freely like a mechanical saw, the whorl formed part of an integrated feeding apparatus. The largest functional teeth occupied the exposed cutting region, while older teeth curled inward toward the center of the spiral. As the lower jaw closed, these teeth moved toward the upper jaw, which appears to have lacked a comparable set of cutting teeth. The arrangement could grip, slice, and draw prey deeper into the mouth through the motion of the jaw itself. Such anatomy suggests a predator adapted for feeding on relatively soft prey. Ammonoids, squid-like cephalopods, and other animals without heavily armored bodies may have been suitable targets. Instead of crushing thick shells in the manner of a broad-toothed Dirophagus predator, Helicoprion possessed a highly specialized cutting system, one refined along an evolutionary lineage extending through tens of millions of years. Its strangeness, then, was not an accident of primitive anatomy. The whorl represented specialization, carried to an extraordinary degree, a feeding structure assembled tooth by tooth within a lineage shaped by the particular opportunities of Paleozoic seas. For generations of paleontologists, Helicoprion existed as an anatomical puzzle because the fossil record had preserved its most unusual feature while removing almost everything needed to understand it. Only when modern imaging allowed researchers to look inside stone did the animal finally begin to recover its proper shape. The spiral that once seemed impossible had always belonged exactly where evolution had placed it, enclosed within the lower jaw of one of the Permian Ocean's most remarkable predators. Long before the Permian had a name, before forests covered continents or vertebrates walked on land, trilobites were already moving through the sea. Their earliest fossils appear around 521 million years ago, near the beginning of the Cambrian period, when complex animal ecosystems were still taking recognizable form. By the late Permian, their greatest age of diversity had passed, yet they remained. The last surviving branches belonged to an order called Proetida, carrying an evolutionary history older than almost every familiar animal lineage alive today. A trilobite was an arthropod belonging to the broad family of jointed, limbed animals that includes modern crabs, insects, and woodlice. Its name came from the three lengthwise lobes dividing its armored body. Across hundreds of millions of years, evolution produced thousands of species in a remarkable range of forms, from tiny animals only fractions of an inch long to giants approaching 28 inches. Their segmented outer skeletons were strengthened with calcite, a mineral form of calcium carbonate that fossilized readily. This durable armor is one reason trilobites left such an unusually detailed record of their existence. Their preserved shells still reveal delicate structures, including joints, spines, and in many species, elaborate compound eyes made from calcite lenses. Some possessed broad fields of vision that allowed them to monitor much of the surrounding water without turning their bodies. There was no single trilobite way of life. Some crawled across sediment searching for edible material. Others burrowed beneath the surface or filtered suspended particles from water. Certain forms became active swimmers, while others occupied deeper environments far from sunlit coastal shallows. Over evolutionary time, their bodies were modified again and again, producing flattened shapes for life near the bottom, streamlined forms for movement through water, and defensive spines suited to seas filled with increasingly capable predators. That adaptability had already been tested on a planetary scale. Around 445 million years ago, the late Ordovician mass extinction eliminated an estimated 85% of marine species. Ocean habitats shifted as global climate changed and sea levels fell. Trilobites suffered enormous losses, but some lineages endured. Roughly 70 million years later came the prolonged crises of the late Devonian. Marine ecosystems again fractured as oxygen levels declined across parts of the ocean and environmental conditions changed repeatedly. Perhaps 75% of species disappeared during those extinction pulses. Once more, trilobites survived, diminished but continuous. Their fossil history, therefore, became an extraordinary thread running through transformations that reshaped the planet. During the span of trilobite existence, plants established themselves on land and eventually produced the first forests. Vertebrates diversified from early aquatic forms into animals capable of moving onto shore. Insects appeared. Vast continental arrangements shifted. Oceans opened and narrowed. Mountain systems rose and eroded, and separate landmasses gradually assembled into Pangaea. Through all of it, somewhere in Earth's oceans, trilobites remained. By the closing Permian, however, their former abundance had contracted dramatically. The Proetida represented the final surviving portion of a lineage that had once spread through marine environments around the world. These remaining animals still inhabited shelf seas, carrying within their bodies a design whose origins reached back more than 250 million years. Their fossils continue through successive layers of ancient sediment until they reach the Permian-Triassic boundary, approximately 252 million years ago. There, the record ends. Above that boundary, paleontologists have never found a confirmed trilobite. No isolated population appears later in the Triassic. No surviving branch emerges in younger rocks. An animal lineage that had persisted for roughly 270 million years leaves its final mineralized traces at one narrow interval in geological time. Everything that remains of them now belongs to stone. Countless fragments of segmented armor preserving the shapes of animals that once experienced more chapters of Earth's changing oceans than almost any complex lineage ever would. Deep beneath the stable interior of what is now north-central Russia, heat was gathering beneath continental rock that had remained far from the restless margins of tectonic plates. The Siberian craton was an ancient foundation, thick and comparatively stable, yet below it, geologists believe an enormous upwelling of unusually hot mantle material was rising toward the base of the crust. This was not the familiar volcanism of a subduction zone, where one tectonic plate descends beneath another. The disturbance was emerging from below. Around 252 million years ago, the crust began to fracture. Magma found pathways upward through those fractures and reached the surface, beginning one of the largest episodes of volcanism known from Earth's geological record. The eruptions did not resemble a single volcanic mountain releasing one immense explosion. Instead, lava emerged repeatedly from extensive fissures, spreading across the landscape in broad sheets. One flow cooled, another covered it, and successive eruptions accumulated into immense layers of basalt. Geologists describe formations of this magnitude as large igneous provinces, places where extraordinary quantities of magma reach or penetrate the crust during a comparatively brief interval of geological time. The Siberian example became known as the Siberian traps. The word traps comes from the Swedish word trappa, meaning staircase, a reference to the stepped terrain produced as erosion cuts through stacked layers of hardened lava. Across the full history of the eruptions, volcanic rocks associated with the province covered an original area estimated at roughly 770,000 square miles, although erosion and later geological processes have obscured parts of its former extent. In some regions, accumulated volcanic material reached depths approaching 2 miles. Estimates of the total magma produced vary considerably, ranging from roughly 240,000 to nearly 1 million cubic miles. Yet the lava visible at the surface was only part of the event. Beneath Siberia, enormous quantities of magma forced their way sideways and upward through existing layers of crust. These underground intrusions formed vast sheets known as sills, spreading between older sedimentary rocks before cooling in place. Their path carried them through geological formations containing materials capable of releasing large quantities of gases when intensely heated. Among those buried layers were ancient deposits rich in coal and other organic matter, along with carbonate rocks and evaporite deposits. Magma entering these formations acted like an immense underground heating system. Carbon that might otherwise have remained stored within the crust was transformed into gases and driven toward the surface through fractures and explosive vents. This interaction between magma and carbon-rich sedimentary rock appears to have greatly increased the environmental influence of the Siberian volcanism. The volcanoes themselves released carbon dioxide, but heating the surrounding crust provided an additional source. Some scientific models suggest these underground interactions may have multiplied the effective release of greenhouse gases beyond what the erupting magma alone could have produced. The distinction matters because the Siberian traps were not simply an unusually large accumulation of lava. Much of their destructive potential came from where the magma traveled and what it encountered along the way. The geological setting turned buried carbon reservoirs into participants in the eruption, connecting processes miles beneath the land to changes spreading through the atmosphere and ocean. Nor did the volcanic system exhaust itself within a human lifetime, or even within the span of a civilization. Major eruptive and intrusive activity unfolded across hundreds of thousands of years, with the broader episode extending for perhaps 1,000,000 years. Individual pulses varied in intensity, separated by intervals during which the landscape cooled while magma continued moving through the crust below. Layer by layer, Siberia acquired its immense staircase of basalt. Beneath those dark volcanic plains, an even larger architecture of frozen magma remained threaded through ancient sediments. What began far below stable continental rock had become a geological system capable of transferring material from Earth's interior into the atmosphere on a planetary scale. The surface eruptions left behind a province of stone. The gases released alongside them did not remain in Siberia. The lava remained where it cooled, eventually becoming rock. The gases released with it were free to travel. Among them was carbon dioxide, entering an atmosphere that could distribute its influence across the entire planet. Estimates of the total carbon released during the Siberian Traps episode vary, with assumptions about volcanic emissions and carbon liberated from heated sediments, but the cumulative amount may have reached tens of thousands of billions of tons, with some reconstructions approaching 100,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Unlike the basalt left behind in Siberia, this material entered a global system of air and water. Its passage can still be detected in ancient stone. Carbon occurs naturally in forms called isotopes, and living organisms, volcanic sources, and geological reservoirs can carry slightly different proportions of them. When an enormous quantity of isotopically light carbon enters the atmosphere and ocean, it changes the chemical balance recorded by sediments forming at that time. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, researchers find a pronounced negative carbon isotope excursion, an abrupt shift indicating that the global carbon cycle had been disturbed on an extraordinary scale. The signal is not confined to Siberia. Boundary rocks in widely separated regions preserve versions of the same disturbance. Geological sequences studied in China, the United Arab Emirates, Greenland, Italy, Austria, and elsewhere record a carbon cycle changing across the planet. Each location preserves its own environmental details, yet together they reveal a disruption too widespread to have been merely regional. Natural systems normally move carbon among the atmosphere, ocean, living organisms, sediments, and rocks. Given sufficient time, weathering and other geological processes can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The difficulty at the end of the Permian was one of pace. Carbon was entering the system faster than these long-term processes could compensate. As its atmospheric concentration increased, carbon dioxide altered Earth's balance of energy. Incoming sunlight warmed the surface, which released energy upward as infrared radiation. Carbon dioxide absorbed and re-emitted part of that outgoing radiation, reducing the amount of heat escaping efficiently into space. With more greenhouse gas present, additional energy remained within the climate system. Most of that accumulating heat did not stay in the air. The ocean is Earth's great reservoir of thermal energy. Because water can absorb enormous amounts of heat, the seas take up roughly 90% of the excess energy added to the modern climate system, and the same physical principle operated in the Permian. As the atmosphere warmed, heat moved into the upper ocean. Currents then carried that energy through marine environments, gradually changing conditions far beyond the volcanic province where the disturbance had begun. This transformation unfolded rapidly by geological standards. Evidence from high-resolution dating and carbon cycle modeling suggests that the most intense phase associated with the main extinction may have developed across tens of thousands of years, with estimates near 60,000 years for critical intervals of carbon release and environmental disruption. Within a human frame, 60,000 years encompasses an immense span of generations. Against the duration of geological systems, it is startlingly brief. Carbon that had been stored underground across ancient ages entered the active atmosphere and ocean faster than many stabilizing processes could remove it. The significance lay not only in how much carbon arrived, but in how rapidly the balance shifted. Marine ecosystems had developed within chemical and climatic boundaries that changed gradually enough for populations to migrate, adapt, or evolve. The Siberian carbon pulse compressed planetary change into a much narrower interval. Heat accumulated first as an invisible alteration of the energy moving between Earth, ocean, and sky. Nothing about carbon dioxide itself announced the scale of the transformation. Yet molecule by molecule, the atmosphere was becoming a different thermal environment, and beneath it, the enormous reservoir of the ocean was beginning to store the consequences. Warm water carries an invisible limitation. As its temperature rises, its ability to hold dissolved oxygen declines. Long before an animal encounters water completely devoid of oxygen, this physical relationship begins narrowing the conditions in which its body can function. Across the warming Permian seas, that limit was shifting over immense areas at once. Chemical traces preserved in carbonate rocks record the change. Ratios of oxygen isotopes sensitive to ancient temperature indicate that sea surface temperatures rose by roughly 14 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit during the crisis. In some equatorial regions, shallow waters may eventually have reached temperatures between 95 and 104 degrees Fahrenheit. These were environments where much marine diversity was concentrated, placing intense thermal stress directly within some of the most biologically productive parts of the ocean. The magnitude becomes clearer against Earth's later climate variations. The difference in global average temperature between a major ice age and a warm interglacial period is generally only several degrees Fahrenheit. The end Permian warming was substantially larger, unfolding within an ocean whose inhabitants were simultaneously experiencing the physiological consequences of declining oxygen availability. Every breath taken through a gill depended upon oxygen dissolved in the surrounding water. As concentrations fell, animals had to move greater volumes of water across respiratory surfaces simply to obtain what their tissues required. Warmer temperatures also accelerated many metabolic processes, increasing oxygen demand precisely when less oxygen was available. Heat and respiration were therefore linked in a tightening biological constraint. Far below the surface, another process was changing. Ocean circulation depends partly on differences in water density. Colder, denser water can sink and move through the depths, carrying dissolved oxygen from contact with the atmosphere into regions where sunlight never reaches. This overturning circulation helps ventilate the deep sea, replacing oxygen continually consumed by animals, microbes, and decomposition. As the climate warmed, temperature contrasts between high and low latitudes weakened. The formation and sinking of dense water became less effective, reducing the movement that supplied oxygen to the depths. The precise circulation of the Permian Ocean differed from the modern system because continents and currents were arranged differently. Yet the underlying physical problem remained. A warmer, more stratified ocean mixed less efficiently from surface to bottom. Life continued consuming what oxygen remained. Microorganisms decomposing organic material on and beneath the seafloor used oxygen during respiration. Under ordinary conditions, circulation could replenish part of that supply. Once ventilation weakened, consumption continued while replacement slowed. Deep waters became increasingly oxygen-poor and in many regions eventually anoxic, containing virtually no usable dissolved oxygen. The boundary between oxygenated and anoxic water did not necessarily remain confined to the abyss. Evidence preserved in ancient sediments suggests that oxygen-depleted waters expanded across continental margins and, at times, reached surprisingly shallow depths. Among the most revealing clues are molecular remnants associated with green sulfur bacteria. These microorganisms thrive under unusual conditions. They require light for photosynthesis, yet inhabit waters containing hydrogen sulfide, a toxic compound associated with oxygen-starved environments. Finding their chemical biomarkers in rocks deposited during the Permian-Triassic crisis indicates that hydrogen sulfide-bearing waters sometimes reached upward into the photic zone, the portion of the sea penetrated by sunlight. That places two normally separated worlds in the same water column. Sunlight was still arriving from above, while chemical conditions associated with anoxic depths had risen high enough for specialized sulfur bacteria to use it. For marine animals, habitable water was being compressed between stresses. Near the surface, extreme warmth increased metabolic demand while reducing oxygen solubility. Below, poorly ventilated water accumulated the products of anaerobic microbial activity. Between them remained a shrinking volume in which temperature, oxygen, and chemistry could still support complex animal life. The transformation had no single advancing edge. It unfolded differently with depth, latitude, circulation, and local geography. Yet across the ocean, the same physical limits were tightening. Oxygen was becoming harder to obtain near the surface and increasingly absent below, while hydrogen sulfide entered waters that had once remained beyond its reach. The ocean had begun losing the breath that complex life depended upon. A shell is built through chemistry. An animal may shape it into ribs, chambers, plates, or delicate walls, but the raw material must first come from the surrounding water. In the Permian seas, countless organisms depended upon calcium carbonate to construct the hard structures that protected their bodies and supported entire communities. As the atmosphere changed above them, the chemical conditions required to maintain those structures began changing as well. Carbon dioxide does not remain confined to the air. At the ocean surface, it dissolves into seawater and enters a series of chemical reactions. Some combines with water to form carbonic acid, which releases hydrogen ions. As their concentration increases, the acidity of seawater rises and its pH falls. Those same reactions also reduce the availability of carbonate ions, essential ingredients used by many marine organisms to build calcium carbonate shells and skeletons. For an animal attempting to grow a shell, the surrounding water had become less cooperative. More biological energy was required to maintain mineral structures as chemical conditions shifted. Where the change became severe enough, exposed calcium carbonate could begin dissolving faster than organisms could repair or replace it. Evidence that this process accompanied the end Permian extinction has been recovered from rocks that once formed beneath ancient tropical seas. In the mountains of the United Arab Emirates, researchers examined sediments deposited across the Permian-Triassic boundary and studied the isotopic composition of boron preserved within them. Because the behavior of boron in seawater changes predictably with pH, these isotopes can serve as a chemical archive of ancient ocean acidity. The record revealed an abrupt acidification event associated with the extinction interval. Rather than relying only on models of what rising atmospheric carbon dioxide should have done, scientists could read evidence of changing seawater chemistry from the sediments themselves. The ancient seabed had retained a molecular trace of an ocean becoming more acidic during one of the greatest biological crises in Earth's history. For shell-building organisms, this chemical disruption arrived alongside stresses already acting upon their bodies. Elevated temperatures increased metabolic demands. Declining oxygen made those demands harder to meet. Acidification added another energetic burden, forcing animals dependent on carbonate minerals to maintain their protective structures in increasingly corrosive water. Fossils near the extinction boundary sometimes preserve shells with unusual thinning, weakened mineralization, or surfaces consistent with dissolution. Interpretation varies among species and local environments, since fossil preservation can alter shells long after death. Yet, combined with geochemical evidence, these remains fit a broader pattern in which calcifying organisms suffered disproportionately as ocean chemistry shifted. The difficulty extended beyond individual shells. Calcium carbonate formed the structural foundation of reefs and other habitats created by generations of marine organisms. When the chemistry governing mineral growth changed, the consequences could spread from the physiology of a single animal to the stability of the environment surrounding it. There was no need for each stress to wait for another to finish. They overlapped. An organism struggling for oxygen still needed energy to regulate its internal chemistry. A creature weakened by extreme warmth still had to grow and repair its skeleton. A shell builder facing more acidic water could not suspend every other biological demand while conditions improved. The same body had to endure all of these pressures together. That convergence made the crisis fundamentally different from a simple change in temperature or a temporary decline in oxygen. Marine animals had evolved within environmental ranges that fluctuated over time, but the combination now developing pushed several physiological boundaries in the same direction. Each stress reduced the capacity to withstand the others. The chemistry of seawater, normally part of the background against which marine evolution unfolded, had become an active force in survival. Shells that represented hundreds of millions of years of successful adaptation were suddenly expensive to build and increasingly difficult to preserve. Across the ocean, life was confronting not one altered environment, but several changes woven together within the same water. Heat strained metabolism. Oxygen retreated. Acidity weakened the mineral foundations on which much of the marine world depended. A reef is more than the animals that build it. Over generations, living colonies raise walls, chambers, ledges, and crevices from the seafloor, creating physical space that other organisms gradually occupy. Each new layer adds another surface for feeding, hiding, attaching, hunting, and reproducing. By the late Permian, this slow biological construction had produced some of the richest habitats in the marine world. Among their principal architects were rugose and tabulate corals, two ancient groups of cnidarians whose evolutionary histories belonged entirely to the Paleozoic seas. Rugose corals appeared in solitary forms shaped like curved horns, while others grew together in colonies. Tabulate corals developed interconnected frameworks, often forming dense patterns of small chambers resembling honeycomb. Neither group has a living representative today. Across warm, shallow seas, their accumulated skeletons helped form reefs whose complexity extended far beyond the individual coral animals. Sponges and other reef builders also contributed to these communities, while spaces within the growing structures became habitat for brachiopods, mollusks, echinoderms, crustaceans, fish, and countless smaller organisms. Some lived exposed on the reef surface. Others occupied narrow cavities within the mineral framework, protected from larger predators and strong currents. This architecture concentrated life into layers. Food drifting through the water could support attached filter feeders. Grazers moved across exposed surfaces. Predators followed prey through channels and openings, while juvenile animals found shelter in spaces inaccessible to larger hunters. A reef altered currents, trapped sediment, and created local variations in light and water movement. The structure itself became part of the ecosystem. As environmental conditions deteriorated near the Permian-Triassic boundary, that relationship between organism and architecture began to unravel. Reef builders were vulnerable to the same combination of stresses spreading through the wider ocean. Excessive warmth pushed organisms beyond physiological tolerances. Declining oxygen restricted respiration, particularly where water circulation became weak. Changing carbonate chemistry made the construction and preservation of mineral skeletons increasingly difficult. Even where parts of a reef remained standing, the living community responsible for maintaining and extending it could fail. The loss then moved outward through ecological connections. Without continued growth, damaged structures were no longer repaired at the same rate. Chemical dissolution and physical erosion worked upon exposed carbonate frameworks. Cavities collapsed or filled with sediment. Surfaces once occupied by living colonies became unavailable to organisms dependent upon them. Species that used reefs as nurseries lost protected spaces for their young, while specialized feeders lost the organisms on which they depended. A habitat built gradually across generations could therefore disappear biologically before its final physical remains were erased. At the extinction boundary, the geological record of substantial Metazoan reef building undergoes an extraordinary interruption. Complex reef ecosystems largely vanish from marine sediments, beginning a prolonged interval often called the early Triassic reef gap. For millions of years, the widespread, elaborate reef structures characteristic of earlier seas were absent or greatly diminished. Microbial buildups occurred in some environments, but the intricate animal-constructed communities of the Permian were gone. The interruption lasted roughly 14 million years before large, complex reefs became firmly established again during the Middle Triassic. Few ecological absences in the marine fossil record are so prolonged. Reefs are among the most spatially complex habitats an ocean can produce, concentrating biodiversity within structures assembled by living organisms themselves. Their disappearance removed not merely species, but an entire way of organizing marine space. When substantial coral reefs returned, their architects belonged to a different lineage. Scleractinian corals emerged during the Triassic and eventually became the principal builders of the coral reefs familiar today. Their appearance marked a new chapter rather than the revival of the old one. Rugose corals did not return. Tabulate corals did not return. The elaborate structures their lineages had created across Paleozoic seas ended with them. For roughly 14 million years, the ocean continued without the kind of complex reef architecture that had once transformed its shallow margins. When living walls finally rose again from the seafloor, they were being constructed by new bodies, following a different evolutionary design. A Permian seafloor could belong to brachiopods in the way a modern coastal bed belongs to mussels. Their shells accumulated across shallow marine habitats in extraordinary densities, sometimes packed closely enough that one animal's resting place began where another's ended. Currents passed over these living beds, carrying suspended particles toward thousands of feeding structures working continuously within the water. For roughly 300 million years, brachiopods had been among the defining animals of marine ecosystems. Although their paired shells make them resemble clams, their internal anatomy and evolutionary history are fundamentally different. During the Paleozoic era, that separate design was remarkably successful. Brachiopods diversified into numerous forms and occupied ecological positions that bivalves, the group containing clams and mussels, would increasingly dominate only later. Their abundance made them more than background inhabitants. By filtering particles from seawater, they participated in nutrient cycling and transferred organic material into benthic food webs. Their shells created surfaces for smaller organisms, while their bodies became food for predators. Generations accumulated into fossil beds so extensive that paleontologists can reconstruct entire communities from the remains. Yet, ecological dominance does not guarantee physiological flexibility. Research published in 2026 by scientists at Stanford University examined a long-standing puzzle surrounding the transition from brachiopod-dominated Paleozoic seas to oceans increasingly dominated by bivalves. By comparing the physiology of living representatives, researchers explored how these animals respond when temperature rises and oxygen availability declines. The difference lies partly in metabolism, the continuous set of chemical processes that keeps an organism functioning. Environmental stress can force an animal to reduce energy consumption when resources become scarce. Many bivalves possess considerable metabolic flexibility. When oxygen falls, they can suppress aspects of their metabolism, lowering energy requirements and enduring unfavorable conditions for longer periods. Living brachiopods appear less capable of making that adjustment rapidly. Under experimental conditions involving warming and reduced oxygen, their physiological limits can be reached sooner. Their metabolism continues demanding resources in an environment increasingly unable to provide them. A clam capable of reducing its energy expenditure may persist through a difficult interval that places a brachiopod under much greater strain. Seen against the end Permian crisis, this difference offers a biological explanation for a profound ecological turnover. The changing ocean did not confront every animal with an equal test. Bodies carried different tolerances into the crisis, inherited from evolutionary histories extending far into the past. Traits that had functioned successfully under familiar conditions could become liabilities when several environmental boundaries shifted together. For brachiopods, this was not evidence of an inferior design. Evolution does not prepare organisms for every possible future. Their physiology had supported extraordinary success across immense spans of time. In the environments where they evolved, the ability to endure prolonged combinations of extreme warmth and severe oxygen loss had rarely determined survival on a global scale. Then the conditions governing that success changed. Many prominent Permian brachiopod lineages suffered devastating losses. Productive brachiopods, once conspicuous components of Paleozoic seafloors, disappeared entirely. Other rhynchonelliform brachiopods survived through only a fraction of their former diversity. Bivalves, possessing different physiological strategies, passed through the crisis more successfully and expanded through ecosystems left open by extinction. Brachiopods never regained their former ecological position. They still exist. Living species can be found today, often in cooler waters, deeper habitats, caves, and other environments where competition with rapidly growing bivalves may be reduced. Their shells remain recognizably brachiopod, preserving a body plan whose ancestry reaches deep into the Paleozoic. In those surviving animals, the ancient ocean has left a living remnant. A lineage that once covered vast stretches of seafloor now persists mostly beyond ordinary human sight, while clams and mussels occupy many of the habitats their distant counterparts once dominated. The transition was not simply one group replacing another. It was a physiological sorting of ancient lineages written into the structure of the modern seafloor. By the final chapters of the Permian, the trilobite story had narrowed to a single surviving branch. The order Proetida remained after countless relatives had already disappeared, its members inhabiting marine environments that represented only a fraction of the range trilobites had once occupied. A lineage formerly expressed through thousands of species and extraordinary variations of form was approaching its end through a dwindling collection of survivors. These last trilobites lived mainly in shelf seas, including waters cooler than the increasingly hostile tropics. Their bodies still carried the ancient architecture inherited from distant ancestors, segmented exoskeletons reinforced with calcite, jointed limbs beneath, and sensory systems adapted to life along the seafloor. That mineral armor had served trilobites through immense changes in predators, climates, continents, and ocean chemistry. Near the Permian-Triassic boundary, maintaining it became increasingly difficult. Calcite is a form of calcium carbonate, and the chemistry required to preserve such mineral structures was shifting as seawater became more acidic. For an animal enclosed within a calcified exoskeleton, this created demands extending through every stage of life. Growth required new mineral material. Damage required repair. Molting required the construction and hardening of another protective surface. At the same time, warmer water held less dissolved oxygen. Even relatively shallow environments could no longer be assumed to provide the conditions on which the remaining populations depended. The last trilobites were caught within overlapping physiological limits, their mineralized bodies challenged by changing chemistry, while their respiration was constrained by heat and oxygen loss. Their fossil record approaches the boundary and then stops. No confirmed trilobite has ever been discovered in Triassic rocks. There is no known refuge containing a lingering population that survived for another million years, no miniature descendant appearing in younger sediments, no isolated lineage waiting in deeper water before returning. After approximately 270 million years of continuous existence, every remaining branch disappears from the record. The scale of that duration is difficult to hold within ordinary measures of time. Trilobites had already existed for tens of millions of years before the first vertebrates developed jaws. Their lineage preceded the appearance of limbs capable of carrying vertebrates across land. They were ancient before insects took flight, and ancient again before complex terrestrial ecosystems developed forms that would eventually become familiar forests. Entire evolutionary innovations appeared while trilobites continued living beneath the water. Their history had also passed through repeated biological crises. The late Ordovician mass extinction removed an estimated 85% of marine species. Later, the prolonged disturbances of the late Devonian eliminated perhaps 75% of species. Other environmental changes followed across intervening ages, repeatedly reshaping marine communities without erasing trilobites completely. Each survival left descendants capable of continuing. Populations shifted, diversity contracted and expanded. New forms occupied different depths and feeding roles. The group changed without breaking the continuity, connecting one generation to the next. At the end of the Permian, that continuity was severed. The main extinction interval may have unfolded across roughly 60,000 years, a span immense beside an individual animal's life, but remarkably compressed against trilobite history. Hundreds of millions of years of adaptation could not guarantee survival when environmental change moved beyond the tolerances retained by the final lineages. There was probably no single generation that experienced the disappearance of the group as an event. Conditions shifted across lifetimes. Reproduction became less successful in some places. Populations contracted in others. Habitats that had supported one generation failed to support enough of the next. Local disappearances accumulated until there was nowhere left for continuity to persist. Somewhere, the final trilobite lived without any knowledge of being the last expression of an ancient design. After it died, the lineage existed only as remains entering sediment. Calcite shells settled into rock, preserving fragments of bodies long after the living chain had ended. The Permian boundary became the final page of a history, extending across 270 million years. Beyond it, every trilobite was stone. The extinction left behind a pattern, and within that pattern was a biological logic. Across the Permian-Triassic boundary, survival was not distributed evenly among marine animals. Some groups suffered near total destruction, while others endured in sufficient numbers to rebuild. A Stanford University study published in 2026 brought physiological evidence to this ancient sorting, connecting the fate of different lineages to the ways their bodies respond when temperature rises and oxygen becomes scarce. The animals most vulnerable tended to share a demanding combination of traits. Many possessed relatively slow or inflexible metabolisms. Some depended heavily upon stable seawater chemistry to construct and maintain mineralized shells or skeletons. Others had narrow tolerances for changes in temperature and oxygen availability. Brachiopods, crinoids, trilobites, rugose corals, and tabulate corals belonged broadly to this older ecological world, the foundational Paleozoic fauna whose history had shaped marine communities across immense spans of time. When conditions deteriorated together, those traits became liabilities. Survival favored a different physiological toolkit. Clams, snails, sea urchins, starfish, and certain fish lineages possessed combinations of characteristics that offered greater resilience under environmental stress. Their advantages were not identical, and no single adaptation protected every survivor. Yet many could tolerate wider fluctuations in oxygen or temperature, depended less completely on vulnerable forms of calcification, or adjusted their energy use more effectively when normal biological activity became difficult. One ability appears especially important: metabolic suppression. Every living animal requires energy simply to remain alive. Cells must maintain internal chemistry, tissues must function, and basic physiological processes continue even when food or oxygen becomes limited. Under favorable conditions, this expenditure can be sustained. During severe environmental stress, however, an animal capable of rapidly reducing its metabolic demands gains time. Some clams can do exactly that. When oxygen falls, they can lower metabolic activity and enter an extremely low energy state, reducing the amount of oxygen and fuel required to maintain essential functions. Normal activity may become impossible, but the organism can persist until surrounding conditions improve enough for metabolism to rise again. Brachiopods possess far less flexibility in this response. Their metabolic rate cannot be suppressed rapidly enough to the same degree. Under warming and deoxygenation, their physiological margin therefore disappears sooner. A body perfectly adequate for ordinary conditions reaches its limits, while a more flexible competitor remains within the boundaries of survival. Nothing about this required new adaptations to appear during the catastrophe. The extinction interval was far too brief for complex animal groups to redesign their fundamental physiology in response. Roughly 60,000 years may contain many generations, but evolution could only work with variation already present among surviving populations. The crucial differences had been inherited from evolutionary histories, extending far deeper into the past. The catastrophe became a filter acting upon those pre-existing differences. On one side stood much of the Paleozoic fauna, organisms whose biology had flourished under the conditions that preceded the crisis. On the other were lineages carrying traits that happened to function better in unstable, warmer, oxygen-depleted environments. They had not evolved in anticipation of disaster. Their bodies simply offered more options when ordinary conditions failed. This distinction helps explain why extinction could transform marine ecosystems without eliminating marine life itself. The survivors were not necessarily stronger, larger, or more sophisticated than those that vanished. They were physiologically suited to enduring a particular combination of stresses at a particular moment in Earth history. Once the filter had passed over the oceans, the balance between major animal groups had changed permanently. Clams and other surviving lineages inherited ecological space once occupied by organisms that had dominated for hundreds of millions of years. The older Paleozoic configuration never recovered its former importance. From that severe selection emerged the beginnings of another ocean. Its inhabitants belonged increasingly to groups familiar in seas today, descendants of bodies that could slow themselves down, endure diminished oxygen, tolerate changing temperatures, and remain alive until the world around them became habitable again. There are places in the geological record where the texture of stone changes because animals have disappeared. Sediment that would normally be disturbed, tunneled through, swallowed, expelled, and rearranged instead, remains stacked in delicate layers. Each lamination rests upon the one beneath it, preserving a structure that living seafloors rarely allow to survive. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, such layers appear across regions of the ancient ocean, recording the absence of countless small movements that had once shaped the seabed. For hundreds of millions of years, burrowing animals had worked through marine sediment. Worms, crustaceans, and other invertebrates carried oxygen downward and brought buried nutrients toward the surface, a process known as bioturbation. Their activity transformed the seafloor into a constantly reworked habitat where chemistry and biology remained intertwined. As oxygen vanished from deeper waters, this hidden labor ceased across vast areas. Burrows disappeared from the sedimentary record. Tracks became scarce. The seabed stopped being turned over. Without animals disturbing it, sediment settled into uninterrupted sheets. The change extended far beyond the disappearance of burrowers. Permian seafloors had possessed height and structure. Crinoids rose from the substrate on anchored stalks, extending feathery feeding arms into passing water. Brachiopod beds crowded available surfaces. Reef frameworks created chambers, crevices, overhangs, and sheltered spaces occupied by communities layered above and within one another. Life had built upward from the bottom, turning bare geology into three-dimensional habitat. As those communities collapsed, much of that architecture vanished with them. Complex surfaces gave way to broad expanses of exposed sediment. In places where animals could no longer survive, microorganisms spread across the vacant ground, forming mats over a seabed that had lost its former inhabitants. The ocean floor became flatter in both physical structure and ecological complexity. Among the organisms that benefited were stromatolite-forming microbial communities, descendants of forms of life with roots extending back more than 3 billion years. Long before animals transformed marine ecosystems, microbial mats had dominated many shallow environments, trapping sediment and building distinctive layered structures over generations. Their renewed prominence during the early Triassic carried an unusual geological meaning. Habitats, once occupied by elaborate animal communities, were again becoming favorable to some of Earth's oldest ecological strategies. This was not a literal return to the Precambrian world. Fish still moved through surviving waters. Mollusks persisted, and scattered animal lineages remained. Yet the visible complexity of many marine environments had been stripped downward so severely that ancient microbial structures could once again occupy ecological space from which later animals had largely displaced them. The chemistry preserved in boundary sediments reveals how far the transformation reached. Molecules derived from isorenieratine, pigments associated with green sulfur bacteria, occur in deposits formed in waters shallow enough for faint sunlight to penetrate. These bacteria thrive only where light overlaps with hydrogen sulfide-rich, oxygen-deprived water. Their chemical traces therefore mark an extraordinary intersection. Conditions once associated with deeper anoxic regions had expanded upward into the illuminated ocean. The boundary between habitable surface waters and poisonous depths had shifted. Across affected seas, hydrogen sulfide entered environments where complex animals had previously lived, while oxygenated refuges contracted. Carcasses reaching the bottom encountered fewer scavengers. Organic matter accumulated where ordinary decomposition pathways had changed. Sediments remained undisturbed because the creatures responsible for mixing them were absent, leaving thin layers to preserve the passage of time with unusual precision. In those layers, the catastrophe became something almost architectural. The intricate vertical spaces of the Permian seabed were replaced by a simpler geometry. Stalks, shells, burrows, colonies, and reef cavities faded from entire environments. Microbial films spread horizontally across surfaces that no longer supported their former abundance. For ages, the seafloor had been a world constructed by living bodies, shaped from within as much as from above. After the extinction, across immense regions of ocean, that world had been compressed into a boundary between water and sediment. What had possessed depth, movement, and structure became, for a time, little more than a surface. Among the scattered survivors entering the earliest Triassic seas was a predator carrying an anatomy inherited from a vanished world. Helicoprion had crossed the Permian-Triassic boundary. Fossils place members of its lineage beyond the extinction horizon, making this large cartilaginous fish one of the rare major predators to persist after the first devastating pulse had removed so much of marine life. Survival, however, did not mean that the world supporting it had survived. The waters Helicoprion entered were biologically diminished at almost every level. Its spiral tooth whorl remained an extraordinary instrument, shaped through tens of millions of years of evolution for capturing and slicing soft-bodied prey. Yet, specialization depends upon continuity. A predator can possess an efficient feeding apparatus and still fail when the network supplying its prey begins to unravel. That unraveling had started far below the level of large animals. At the sunlit surface, communities of phytoplankton responsible for converting sunlight and dissolved carbon into organic matter had been disrupted. Evidence preserved in earliest Triassic sediments records an interval of unusually low organic carbon accumulation, interpreted by researchers as part of a severe collapse in marine productivity. The biological pump, the vast planetary process through which photosynthetic organisms capture carbon near the surface and transfer some of it into deeper waters, had weakened. This mattered to creatures that never encountered phytoplankton directly. Tiny drifting organisms fed upon primary producers. Larger animals consumed those grazers. Predatory invertebrates and fish depended upon the animals above them, while the largest hunters occupied positions supported by every transfer of energy beneath them. Remove enough production near the beginning of that chain, and scarcity travels upward. Helicoprion therefore survived into an ocean whose capacity to feed a large specialized predator had been profoundly reduced. The ammonoids and squid-like animals associated with its probable diet faced their own severe pressures. Marine communities were fragmented, habitats had contracted, and populations that persisted did so within ecosystems operating at a fraction of their former richness. For an apex predator, even surviving the immediate environmental crisis could become a prolonged biological trap. Large bodies require reliable energy. Specialized feeding structures are valuable only while suitable prey remains abundant enough to sustain them. In this sense, extinction could continue after the most destructive interval had passed. The initial catastrophe removed organisms directly through heat, oxygen loss, chemical stress, and ecological collapse. Its aftermath then worked through dependency. A species might tolerate the physical conditions, yet disappear because another species had vanished first. Predators could outlive their prey temporarily, sustained by dwindling populations until reproduction faltered and the remaining lineage narrowed toward extinction. Helicoprion appears to have followed that path. Its fossils extend into the early Triassic, then stop. The lineage that had carried the remarkable tooth whirl through changing Permian seas disappears completely from the record. Nothing comparable inherited its exact design. The spiral had taken an immense span of evolutionary time to refine. New teeth formed continuously, pushing older teeth inward along the coil, while the functional outer portion remained positioned for feeding. Generation after generation had preserved and modified this arrangement until Helicoprion possessed one of the most specialized jaws known among ancient marine predators. Yet evolution preserves no investment simply because it took a long time to create. An adaptation exists only within the ecological circumstances that make it useful. When those circumstances disappear, millions of years of refinement can become irrelevant within a geological instant. Helicoprion had survived the boundary, but it could not survive the ocean beyond it. The predator and the ecosystem that had shaped its anatomy belonged to the same fading order. Its final disappearance marked more than the loss of another large hunter. It closed an evolutionary experiment that would never be repeated, leaving behind only mineralized spirals from a feeding mechanism built for prey, food webs, and seas that no longer existed. Recovery began in miniature. Roughly 1.5 million years after the main extinction pulse, the shallow seas contained communities assembled from the remnants of catastrophe. A few resilient lineages had multiplied where conditions permitted, occupying ecological space left vacant by vanished animals. Their presence suggested that marine ecosystems had begun the long process of reconstruction, but the stability beneath them was temporary. The Siberian volcanic system had not finished reshaping the planet. At the boundary between the Smithian and Spathian stages of the early Triassic, rocks record another sharp disturbance in the global carbon cycle. Marine deposits from Italy and other regions preserve a second negative carbon isotope excursion, evidence that another large influx of isotopically light carbon entered the ocean and atmosphere. The chemical shift coincides with renewed ecological disruption, linking this interval to another episode of environmental stress. Temperatures rose again. Oxygen availability declined. Seawater chemistry shifted further from conditions favorable to many shell-building organisms. Each pressure arrived upon ecosystems already stripped of much of their former diversity, leaving the survivors to endure another change before complex communities had time to become established. The creatures dominating many early Triassic environments reflected how narrow the possibilities for survival had become. Mollusks, particularly small clams and snails, were widespread. Many measured only a few inches or less. Their modest size was part of a broader pattern sometimes described as the Lilliput effect, in which surviving and newly appearing species after major extinctions tend towards smaller body sizes. Smaller bodies generally require less food and oxygen, mature more rapidly, and can reproduce with fewer resources, useful advantages in an unstable ecosystem. These seas were therefore populated, but population was not the same as recovery. Diversity remained low, ecological roles were simplified, and communities were often dominated by a limited number of hardy species. Where the Permian Ocean had supported intricate relationships among specialized organisms, much of the early Triassic Ocean favored creatures capable of tolerating scarcity and rapid environmental change. The pattern repeated across an immense interval. Conditions would ease enough for populations to expand. Habitats would begin accumulating greater diversity. Food webs would lengthen slightly as additional organisms established themselves. Then another disturbance associated with continuing volcanism and climate instability would interrupt the process. Gains made over thousands of generations could be reduced before ecosystems reached anything resembling their earlier complexity. Paleontologist Michael Benton of the University of Bristol has described this aftermath as a succession of attempted recoveries repeatedly pushed backward by renewed crises. For roughly 5 million years, life existed beneath the influence of environmental instability left by the extinction and its volcanic causes. Recovery became less like a steady ascent and more like a sequence of fragile advances separated by reversals. This changes the scale on which the Great Dying must be understood. The extinction boundary preserved in rock may appear as a narrow line separating geological periods, yet the biological experience surrounding it unfolded across millions of years. No animal witnessed the entire catastrophe. Countless generations were born, reproduced, and died within its aftermath, knowing only the conditions of their own brief lives. To them, there was no single moment when the old ocean ended. There were warmer waters, shrinking habitats, unreliable food, diminished oxygen, and communities containing fewer kinds of neighbors. A clam living long after the first extinction pulse inhabited a world already transformed before it was born. Its descendants might spread during an interval of relative stability, only for another environmental pulse to narrow their range again. The catastrophe persisted through accumulation. Each disruption removed possibilities from ecosystems that had barely begun replacing what was lost. Complexity returned slowly because the conditions required to sustain it would not remain stable for long enough. Across those millions of years, the ocean was not simply recovering from extinction, it was repeatedly attempting recovery while the forces behind the extinction continued to operate. What disappeared was therefore dismantled in stages, leaving successive generations to inherit seas that remained biologically thinner, chemically harsher, and less capable of supporting the elaborate living world that had once occupied them. Extinction can be counted in fossils, yet the final number describes only part of what disappeared. Once the volcanic forcing weakened enough for the oceans to begin settling into more stable conditions, paleontologists could read the surviving record across the boundary. Layer after layer revealed a biological subtraction unmatched anywhere else in the history of complex marine life. Estimates vary with the fossils examined and the methods used, but studies place marine species loss between roughly 81 and 96%. At the upper estimate, only about 4 species out of every 100 crossed the extinction interval. Entire branches of evolutionary history ended, leaving no descendants to carry their forms into later seas. Every trilobite lineage was gone after roughly 270 million years of continuous existence. Rugose corals vanished completely, along with tabulate corals and the reef traditions they had maintained. Blastoids, stalked relatives of starfish and sea urchins, disappeared forever. Productive brachiopods reached the end of their history. Many bryozoan groups also vanished, removing colonies of tiny filter feeders that had occupied marine surfaces and contributed to complex benthic communities. Other groups survived only through severe reductions. Crinoids, once abundant across broad stretches of seafloor, passed through the boundary in a small number of surviving lineages. Ammonoids, whose coiled shells had belonged to hundreds of species, may have been reduced to only a handful capable of enduring the altered seas. Numerous fish groups suffered heavy losses. Brachiopods survived as a whole, yet their former ecological dominance never returned. The animals that had once covered extensive marine habitats became minor participants in ecosystems increasingly occupied by other shell-bearing groups. The percentage becomes more tangible when imagined against the diversity of a modern ocean. Remove 96 of every 100 marine species alive today, and almost every familiar community unravels. Most specialized predators disappear because their prey are gone. Reef communities lose the organisms that construct their habitat. Complex food webs contract into short chains, supported by whatever adaptable producers, scavengers, filter feeders, and opportunistic hunters remain. Such a comparison cannot reproduce the exact pattern of the Permian extinction, since modern groups differ profoundly from those ancient ecosystems. It does, however, reveal what a loss approaching 96% means biologically. Survival at that scale does not preserve a smaller version of the former ocean. It leaves fragments. Species counts alone cannot measure everything contained within those fragments. Every ecosystem is also a network of relationships accumulated through evolutionary time. A predator becomes suited to particular prey. A filter feeder adapts to specific currents and food particles. A larval animal depends upon a certain habitat for shelter. One species builds structures used by hundreds of others, while another processes nutrients that sustain organisms it never directly encounters. These connections can take millions of years to develop. Natural selection gradually adjusts bodies, behaviors, reproductive cycles, and feeding strategies until organisms become woven into communities whose parts depend upon one another in ways fossils can only partly reveal. During the Great Dying, those relationships were severed alongside the species themselves. When a reef builder vanished, its loss extended beyond a single lineage to every creature using the structure it created. When prey disappeared, specialized predators inherited an ecosystem in which their adaptations no longer had a purpose. The extinction of one organism could therefore continue outward through many others, multiplying the biological consequences beyond any simple count of fossil names. What remained was not merely an ocean containing fewer animals. It was an ocean whose ancient connections had been broken. The survivors carried pieces of the former world within their bodies, but the ecological arrangements surrounding them were gone. Hundreds of millions of years of accumulated interactions had been reduced to scattered lineages, occupying simplified communities. Evolution could generate diversity again, but it could not restore precisely what had vanished. The lost species would never return, and neither would the intricate relationships that had once bound them together. The final count, then, reaches beyond 96%. It includes vanished forms, abandoned ecological roles, broken dependencies, and evolutionary experiments that ended without descendants. The Permian Ocean did not simply lose most of its species. It lost much of the living architecture that had made it the ocean it was. The first maps of the early Triassic Ocean would have required surprisingly few biological colors. Fossil beds separated by immense distances begin to repeat the same limited cast of survivors, as though geography had lost some of its power to shape life. Communities from low latitudes and higher latitudes, once distinguished by long histories of local adaptation, became unusually similar. Researchers describe this pattern as taxonomic homogenization, a global narrowing in which different marine regions increasingly contained the same kinds of animals. Before the extinction, location mattered profoundly. Temperature gradients divided tropical waters from cooler seas. Currents carried nutrients along distinct routes. Depth created separate ecological provinces, while coastlines, continental shelves, and isolated basins allowed populations to follow independent evolutionary paths. Across millions of years, these differences accumulated. Species became suited to particular combinations of food, chemistry, temperature, predators, and habitat, giving each region a biological character formed by both environment and history. The extinction weakened those distinctions because the survivors represented an unusually narrow selection of life. Animals capable of tolerating unstable temperatures, depleted oxygen, and disrupted food supplies could occupy environments that had defeated more specialized organisms. With fewer competitors and fewer ecological barriers, broadly tolerant species expanded across enormous ranges. Small bivalves and gastropods appeared repeatedly in early Triassic deposits, sometimes forming communities dominated by only a few widespread forms. Such uniformity was not evidence of a flourishing global ecosystem. It reflected the opposite condition. The surviving animals could spread so widely because much of the biological resistance that once separated one community from another had disappeared. Ecological vacancies extended across continents and ocean basins. Where specialized species had once divided habitats into intricate networks of niches, generalists encountered open space. For millions of years, this produced what might be called a great dulling. Traveling through those ancient seas, if such a journey had been possible, would have revealed fewer biological transitions with changing latitude. The identities of common animals would have remained familiar across distances where earlier oceans had supported increasingly distinct communities. Regional ecosystems still responded to local conditions, but the larger pattern had become strikingly repetitive. That repetition exposes a dimension of extinction that percentages cannot fully capture. Biodiversity is more than the total number of species alive at one moment. It also resides in difference itself, in the fact that one place contains forms absent from another. A tropical shelf, a temperate coast, and a polar basin become biologically distinctive through long periods of separation, adaptation, competition, migration, and chance. Their uniqueness is an inheritance accumulated gradually, one divergence at a time. When extinction removes the specialists and leaves a small collection of adaptable survivors, that inheritance can disappear even where life remains abundant enough to cover the seafloor. Two regions may each contain living animals, yet if both contain nearly the same organisms performing nearly the same ecological roles, the planet has lost another layer of diversity. The early Triassic Ocean carried this loss across a global scale. Its surviving communities were connected by sameness. Local evolutionary histories had been shortened to a common vocabulary of endurance, favoring creatures able to persist wherever tolerable conditions remained. Over geological time, isolation and adaptation would begin producing differences again. Populations would separate, environments would diverge, and new ecological relationships would accumulate. Yet, such complexity could not simply reappear when the immediate crisis eased. Regional identity required evolutionary time, measured across countless generations. The Great Dulling, therefore, marked more than an interval of low species richness. It was a world in which the ocean had lost much of its biological geography. The ancient distinctions between distant communities had faded, leaving widely scattered seas inhabited by variations of the same reduced assembly. Life remained, but the intricate regional signatures written across the Permian Ocean had been erased, replaced for millions of years by a simpler and more uniform expression of survival. Recovery did not proceed in the orderly sequence that an ecological diagram might suggest. In the simplest model, productivity returns first, small consumers multiply, larger prey follow, and predators recover only after the lower levels of the food web can support them. Yet, the early Triassic fossil record preserves a more unusual arrangement. Large mobile animals began diversifying, while many of the habitats and communities beneath them remained profoundly diminished. Approximately 5 million years after the main extinction pulse, sizable predators were already returning to marine ecosystems. Global fossil data indicate that animals occupying higher positions in food chains expanded rapidly into ecological vacancies opened by the disappearance of their predecessors. Evolutionary opportunity existed almost everywhere. Entire predatory roles had been abandoned, and surviving lineages could diversify without encountering the crowded competition that had shaped the Permian seas. Far below them, recovery followed another pace. Seafloor communities were only beginning to regain complexity. Many benthic ecosystems remained dominated by relatively simple assemblages of hardy mollusks and other tolerant organisms. The elaborate communities that once partitioned food, shelter, and living space among numerous, specialized species had not been reconstructed. This created an ecological pattern that Paul Wignall of the University of Leeds and fellow researchers have described as a top-down recovery. Predators, in other words, appeared before the ecological foundation beneath them had fully matured. Their presence did not mean the ocean had healed. A large hunter can occupy an empty niche relatively rapidly if enough prey exists to sustain a small population. But a resilient ecosystem requires far more than isolated feeding relationships. Stable food webs depend upon overlapping pathways through which energy moves from primary producers into herbivores, filter feeders, scavengers, smaller predators, and eventually larger hunters. When one pathway fails, another can sometimes compensate. Early Triassic communities possessed fewer of these alternatives. That simplicity left recovery vulnerable to environmental disturbance. A population dependent upon a narrow prey base could decline sharply when that prey encountered another episode of warming or oxygen stress. With fewer species performing similar ecological functions, the loss of one group could remove an entire pathway through the food web. Complexity, which often provides ecosystems with a degree of resilience, had not yet had sufficient evolutionary time to accumulate. Nowhere was this missing structure more visible than in the absence of reefs. For approximately 14 million years after the extinction, substantial reef building remained largely absent from the marine record. The ocean could contain predators again long before it could reconstruct the immense biological architecture required for a mature reef ecosystem. When extensive reefs eventually returned during the Triassic, their principal animal builders belonged to a different coral lineage. Scleractinian corals emerged in the Triassic fossil record and became the foundation of new reef systems, replacing ecological roles left vacant by the vanished rugose and tabulate corals. These new builders constructed habitats that would eventually support increasingly elaborate communities, but their rise represented replacement rather than restoration. The distinction matters. Recovery after mass extinction does not rewind an ecosystem to an earlier state. It begins with whatever organisms happen to survive, then allows selection, migration, competition, and evolutionary innovation to assemble something new. Some empty roles may be occupied rapidly. Others remain vacant for millions of years. Entire forms of habitat may have to arise again through unrelated lineages capable of performing similar functions. The early Triassic Ocean, therefore, existed in an unusual state of partial reconstruction. Large hunters moved through waters whose ecological foundations were still developing. Small, resilient animals occupied recovering bottoms. Reef structures remained absent across vast intervals, while microbial communities persisted in places once shaped by more elaborate animal ecosystems. Life had returned unevenly, following opportunity rather than architectural order. The upper levels of some food chains reappeared before the lower communities had regained their former depth and redundancy. What emerged was not yet a fully rebuilt ocean, but a collection of biological possibilities, loosely connected and vulnerable, gradually accumulating the relationships from which lasting complexity could grow. 50 million years is long enough for continents to shift, mountains to rise, climates to change, and entire branches of life to become unfamiliar. That immense interval now marks the estimated time required for marine ecosystems to recover their full complexity after the Great Dying. No other mass extinction in the history of complex life is known to have demanded such a prolonged rebuilding. Placed against the world of the present, the scale becomes easier to sense. 50 million years ago, the distant ancestors of whales still possessed functional legs and lived partly or entirely on land. The great uplift that would produce the highest reaches of the Himalayas was only beginning as India collided with Asia. Many modern groups of birds and mammals were entering periods of rapid diversification. An interval containing transformations of that magnitude passed before the oceans again supported ecosystems comparable in complexity to those erased at the end of the Permian. Yet recovery did not mean restoration. The biological world that eventually emerged was assembled from survivors and newcomers, not reconstructed from a preserved Permian design. Evolution cannot retrieve an extinct lineage once its final population has vanished. Every lost body plan closes a path that had been shaped by inheritance across immense spans of time. The spaces left behind may eventually be occupied, but the organisms entering them arrive with different anatomies, behaviors, histories, and possibilities. Brachiopods remained alive, yet never regained their former command of the sea floor. Crinoids persisted, but their ancient abundance was not restored. Trilobites had disappeared completely, leaving no descendants to participate in the rebuilding. Rugose and tabulate corals were gone as well. Across the oceans, the characteristic Paleozoic fauna and ecological configuration assembled over roughly 300 million years had passed beyond recovery. Into those vacancies came another marine order. Clams and other mollusks expanded into ecological territory, once dominated by brachiopods. Ammonoids diversified repeatedly, filling open water niches with an extraordinary range of coiled forms. Scleractinian corals became major reef builders, constructing new centers of marine diversity from a lineage different from the corals that had shaped Permian reefs. Predatory roles changed just as profoundly. During the Mesozoic era, reptiles entered the sea and produced forms unlike anything that had occupied the Permian Oceans. Ichthyosaurs developed streamlined bodies suited to sustained swimming. Plesiosaurs followed another anatomical path, combining broad bodies with powerful flippers and, in many species, remarkably elongated necks. Much later, mosasaurs became formidable marine predators during the closing portion of the Cretaceous period. None represented a return of the vanished world. Each belonged to an evolutionary experiment made possible within the ecological space extinction had opened. Food webs changed with them. New relationships formed between predators and prey, between reef builders and reef inhabitants, between animals living within sediment and those swimming far above it. Generations accumulated into populations. Populations divided into species, and species gradually became specialized for environments that themselves continued to evolve. Complexity returned through countless interactions layered upon one another, each dependent on earlier stages that had survived long enough to provide a foundation. By the time marine ecosystems had fully regained their richness, the resemblance to the Permian world lay mostly in function rather than identity. Oceans again possessed reefs, hunters, grazers, filter feeders, burrowers, scavengers, and intricate networks of dependence. But the names, bodies, and evolutionary histories behind those roles had changed. The Great Dying therefore left a boundary deeper than a line in rock. On one side stood an oceanic order whose roots reached far into the Paleozoic. On the other grew the foundations of a different world, assembled slowly across 50 million years from the fragments that remained. Life rebuilt complexity, but it did so without recovering what had vanished. The resulting ocean was not the old sea healed. It was another sea entirely, shaped within the spaces the old one left behind. The familiar ocean is, in one sense, a collection of inheritances. Beneath its surface, across reefs, continental shelves, open water, and the deepest inhabited seafloors, the animals that dominate modern marine ecosystems belong to branches of life that passed through the Permian-Triassic extinction. Their ancestors did not inherit an intact world. They inherited vacancies, ecological spaces left open when older lineages disappeared. And over the next 252 million years, those survivors and their descendants transformed those openings into the ocean we recognize. Among the clearest examples are the bivalves, the great lineage containing clams, mussels, oysters, and scallops. Before the extinction, brachiopods occupied much of the ecological territory that bivalves command today. Both groups possessed shells and often lived by filtering suspended food from seawater, yet their histories diverged at the boundary. Brachiopod diversity collapsed, while surviving bivalves entered a marine world where competition had been drastically reduced. Their expansion continued through later geological periods until habitats, once associated with brachiopod abundance, became increasingly occupied by mollusks. The balance established after the catastrophe never returned to its earlier state. Other survivors carried their inheritance differently. Echinoderm lineages that endured the extinction eventually produced the diversity represented today by sea urchins, starfish, brittle stars, and their relatives. Across immense evolutionary intervals, descendants spread through environments ranging from coastal shallows to abyssal plains. The forms moving across modern seabeds are therefore part of a history shaped not simply by adaptation, but by the opportunities created when so many competing branches vanished. Fish underwent an equally profound rearrangement. The Permian seas contained a mixture of lineages, unlike the assemblages swimming through modern oceans. After the extinction, surviving branches diversified into ecological spaces opened by the collapse. Among their distant beneficiaries were the teleosts, the enormous radiation of bony fishes that eventually came to represent approximately 96% of living fish species. Their modern dominance emerged long after the initial catastrophe, yet the evolutionary landscape in which that radiation unfolded had been fundamentally altered by the losses at the end of the Permian. Even the architecture of tropical seas carries the same inheritance. The coral structures familiar today are built primarily by scleractinian corals, whose fossil record begins in the Triassic, after the extinction had removed the principal reef-building corals of the Paleozoic. From this newer lineage came the architects responsible for the framework of modern tropical reef ecosystems. The Great Barrier Reef, Caribbean reefs, And the extraordinary concentrations of diversity across the coral triangle belong to a reef tradition different from the one that flourished before the Great Dying. This does not make modern animals temporary replacements for superior creatures that came before them. Evolution has no predetermined hierarchy and no final destination. Survival depended upon particular traits meeting particular conditions at a particular moment in Earth history. Once the extinction passed, those surviving bodies became the raw material from which later marine evolution could proceed. Seen across geological time, the modern ocean is therefore ancient and surprisingly young at once. Life within it carries ancestry extending far beyond 252 million years. Yet the broad ecological arrangement surrounding that life was profoundly reset at the Permian-Triassic boundary. Dominant groups changed. Reefs acquired new builders. Food webs were reconstructed around different participants. Entire evolutionary possibilities disappeared, while others expanded into spaces that had never before been available to them. Every oyster bed, coral reef, school of bony fish, and starfish crossing the seafloor belongs to that continuing aftermath. The ocean before us is not the Permian Sea preserved through time. It is the world assembled after that sea was broken apart, shaped generation by generation by lineages whose distant ancestors happened to endure. What fills the water today is the inheritance of those survivors, a living ocean built upon foundations laid 252 million years ago. A seawater sample can hold a history larger than itself. Within its temperature, dissolved oxygen, and acidity lies a record of how the ocean exchanges energy and carbon with the atmosphere. Today, instruments drifting across the surface, descending through the water column, and resting on research vessels are recording changes in all three. They are the same broad environmental pressures preserved in rocks from the end of the Permian, although the modern ocean has not reached the extreme conditions of that ancient catastrophe. Since the 19th century, the upper ocean has warmed as human activity has increased the concentration of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The ocean absorbs most of the excess heat trapped within the climate system, slowing atmospheric warming while storing enormous amounts of energy in seawater. Average global sea surface temperatures have risen by roughly 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 19th century, with recent decades bringing particularly rapid increases. That additional heat does more than raise temperature. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen, alters circulation, shifts the boundaries of marine habitats, and increases physiological stress for organisms already living near their thermal limits. Carbon dioxide follows another pathway into the sea. As atmospheric concentrations rise, some of the gas dissolves into surface water and participates in chemical reactions that increase hydrogen ion concentration. Since the beginning of industrialization, average surface ocean acidity has increased by roughly 30%. Because the acidity scale is logarithmic, a numerical change that appears small represents a substantial alteration in seawater chemistry. For organisms that build shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate, these changes can make construction more energetically demanding and can reduce the availability of the chemical building blocks their bodies require. At the same time, oxygen is declining in many marine environments. The global ocean has lost roughly 2% of its dissolved oxygen since the middle of the 20th century. Warming contributes directly because heated seawater retains less oxygen, while changes in circulation can reduce the movement of oxygen-rich surface waters into deeper regions. Along some coasts, nutrients carried from agriculture and wastewater stimulate large blooms of microscopic organisms. When this organic material sinks and decomposes, microbes consume dissolved oxygen, creating zones where many animals struggle to remain. Each process can be studied separately, yet marine organisms experience them together. A fish coping with warmer water may require more oxygen precisely when less is available. A shell-building animal facing altered carbonate chemistry must spend additional energy maintaining its body while temperature raises metabolic demand. The danger lies partly in these interactions, where one form of environmental stress can amplify another. Permian-Triassic boundary rocks preserve an ancient version of such interconnected change on a vastly more extreme scale. Geochemists read variations in carbon isotopes as evidence of enormous disruption to the carbon cycle. Other chemical indicators record warming, declining oxygen, and profound changes in ocean chemistry. Layer by layer, sediments preserve the progression of a planetary system driven beyond conditions that much existing marine life could tolerate. Modern measurements do not mean that another great dying is predetermined, nor that today's ocean has already crossed the same thresholds. The rates, causes, geography, and magnitude of environmental change must be compared with care. Yet, the ancient record gives scientists something rare: evidence of how interacting stresses behaved when sustained disruption continued far enough to reorganize marine ecosystems on a planetary scale. In that sense, the boundary rocks function as more than an archive. Their chemistry connects biological loss with measurable physical change, allowing ancient catastrophe to become evidence that can be tested against observations made today. Every modern temperature record, oxygen measurement, and seawater sample adds another point to that comparison. The ocean is being observed while its chemistry changes, and the rocks beneath it preserve what happened when changes in the same fundamental systems once continued much further. Rate changes the meaning of environmental change. A species may endure a large shift if generations have enough time to migrate, adapt, or be replaced by descendants better suited to new conditions. Compress the same transformation into a much shorter interval, and those pathways narrow. The destination may be similar, yet the biological journey toward it becomes far more difficult. During the end Permian crisis, the Siberian traps released immense quantities of carbon into the atmosphere across repeated volcanic episodes lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Estimates vary because scientists must reconstruct ancient emissions from rocks altered by more than 250 million years of geological history. Even with those uncertainties, research indicates that the modern human release of carbon dioxide is occurring at a rate substantially faster than the average rate associated with that ancient volcanic disturbance. That distinction matters because the ocean responds not only to how much carbon enters the Earth system, but to how rapidly it arrives. Carbon dioxide absorbed by seawater changes carbonate chemistry. Atmospheric warming transfers additional heat into the ocean. Warmer water holds less oxygen, while altered circulation can further restrict its renewal at depth. When these pressures develop slowly enough, some organisms can shift their ranges across generations. Populations may move toward cooler waters, and evolutionary change may gradually favor individuals possessing greater tolerance. Speed removes much of that time. The main extinction interval at the Permian-Triassic boundary unfolded across tens of thousands of years, with the broader environmental crisis extending far longer. That was rapid by geological standards, yet it still encompassed more generations than the centuries over which modern industrial emissions are transforming atmospheric and ocean chemistry. Human civilization is concentrating a major carbon cycle disturbance into an interval that is extraordinarily brief compared with the rhythms under which most marine lineages evolved. Physiology cannot simply redesign itself when conditions change. The ability of an animal to tolerate heat, low oxygen, or altered seawater chemistry depends partly upon traits inherited from ancestors. Some species possess broad tolerances because their evolutionary history happened to produce them. Others occupy narrow environmental ranges and function close to biological limits. Natural selection can alter populations, sometimes surprisingly rapidly, but adaptation requires heritable variation, successful reproduction, and enough surviving individuals for selection to act upon. When environmental change outruns those processes, extinction becomes more likely. Movement offers another escape, but geography places boundaries around it. A marine species following cooler water toward the poles may eventually encounter continents, unsuitable depths, disappearing habitat, or simply the end of available ocean. Reef organisms cannot carry their entire ecosystem with them. Species bound together through feeding, reproduction, shelter, or symbiosis may respond at different speeds, separating relationships that once functioned within the same place. The physical system also carries momentum. Oceans store heat for long periods, and carbon dioxide remains influential within the Earth system across generations. Declining sea ice can expose darker surfaces that absorb additional solar energy. Thawing permafrost can release more greenhouse gases. Changes in biological productivity and ocean circulation can alter how carbon moves between atmosphere, surface waters, and the deep sea. These processes differ from the mechanisms operating during the Great Dying, but they share an important principle. Environmental change can produce responses that continue after the original disturbance begins. The Permian record, therefore, offers no exact script for the present. Continents occupy different positions, ecosystems contain different organisms, and the sources and duration of carbon release are not identical. What it provides is something more precise than a simple analogy. It demonstrates that rapid disruption of the carbon cycle can connect warming, oxygen loss, changing ocean chemistry, and biological collapse. The ancient ocean endured an enormous disturbance delivered over geological time and lost much of its life. The modern experiment is younger, its outcome unwritten, and its defining feature is the compressed pace at which change is being imposed. Extinction leaves behind an absence that cannot be measured by counting fossils alone. A lineage may vanish in an instant of geological time, yet what disappears with it can represent hundreds of millions of years of accumulated history. Evolution does not preserve blueprints for later use. Once a particular branch is cut from the tree of life, the exact sequence of changes that created it cannot simply begin again. The brachiopods of the Permian had inherited roughly 300 million years of evolutionary refinement. Across that immense span, their shells, feeding structures, reproductive strategies, and relationships with surrounding organisms had been shaped by environments that changed around them. Predators learned to exploit them. Competitors divided habitats with them. Other creatures settled among their communities. Each interaction altered the selective pressures acting upon the next generation. What existed at the end of the Permian was therefore more than a collection of species. It was the result of countless biological negotiations conducted across deep time. When those communities collapsed, their history could not be restored by filling the empty spaces with new animals. Later bivalves might occupy similar habitats and perform some comparable ecological functions, but resemblance of function is not continuity of lineage. Their evolutionary inheritance was different. They arrived carrying another anatomy, another ancestry, another set of possibilities. The same finality followed the disappearance of the rugose and tabulate corals. Their reefs had been constructed through relationships particular to the Paleozoic seas. Growth forms interacted with currents, sediment, depth, and neighboring organisms, producing habitats whose structures reflected the biology of their builders. Creatures evolved within those spaces, using cavities for shelter, surfaces for attachment, and surrounding waters for feeding. When the corals vanished, the web of dependencies woven around their architecture vanished with them. Much later, scleractinian corals became major reef builders, creating ecosystems of extraordinary richness. Yet these were not repaired Permian reefs. Their foundations rested upon different biological mechanisms and evolutionary histories. Life had returned to the work of reef construction, but it was using new materials and new relationships. An ecological role had reappeared without resurrecting the world that once occupied it. Trilobites reveal this distinction even more clearly. For more than 270 million years, their lineage produced an enormous variety of forms adapted to life across ancient seas. Some moved over sediment, others burrowed, swam, scavenged, or processed particles of food. Their segmented bodies and mineralized exoskeletons represented one remarkably successful solution to survival in marine environments. At the end of the Permian, that entire evolutionary experiment stopped. No later animal could become a trilobite by entering the same habitat. Natural selection might produce another creature that burrowed through similar sediment or consumed similar food, but it would begin from a different ancestral body. The resulting organism would carry another arrangement of inherited structures. Evolution can revisit functions, yet it cannot retrace history exactly, because every new pathway begins from whatever life happens to remain. This is the deeper boundary created by mass extinction. Recovery can restore diversity. Food webs can lengthen again. Reefs can rise, predators can diversify, and ecosystems can eventually regain intricate networks of dependence. Given enough time, biological richness may return in forms that rival what existed before. But elapsed evolutionary time itself cannot be replaced. The Permian Ocean was assembled through circumstances that occurred only once. Particular continents, climates, currents, competitors, mutations, extinctions, and accidents unfolding in a particular order. Remove the organisms produced by that sequence, and the sequence cannot be replayed. 300 million years cannot be rerun with identical outcomes. The Great Dying therefore erased more than living populations. It closed evolutionary histories whose next chapters would never be written. The ocean eventually filled its vacancies, but filling an absence is not the same as recovering what occupied it. Life continued from the fragments that remained, carrying the planet into another age, while an entire configuration of existence became something preserved only in stone. A boundary only a fraction of an inch thick can divide two versions of the planet. In marine rocks formed around 252 million years ago, the transition from the Permian into the Triassic is preserved as a chemical break that appears across widely separated regions. Fossils change across it, but so does the composition of the sediment itself. The ocean that exists today contains different water, circulated and exchanged through the Earth system across immense spans of time. Yet the consequences of that ancient transformation remain embedded in stone and living bodies. Scientists can follow the extinction through changes in carbon isotopes preserved within marine deposits. These variations record a major disturbance to the global carbon cycle, leaving a recognizable pattern at the boundary. Comparable signals have been identified in geological sections separated by entire continents and ancient ocean basins. The details vary with local conditions, sedimentation, and preservation, but the broader disruption is remarkably widespread. It is a planetary fingerprint left by a carbon cycle pushed far beyond its earlier state. Sediment cores extend this record beneath modern seas, layers accumulated grain by grain, storing traces of changing oxygen conditions, biological productivity, and seawater chemistry. Each location offers only a fragment, yet together these fragments reveal a disturbance that crossed geographic boundaries. The extinction was not confined to one coastline or isolated basin. Its chemical imprint entered the global ocean system, becoming part of the geological archive from which the event can now be reconstructed. Its influence also survives in the geography of living animals. Brachiopods remain in modern seas, but their former ecological prominence never returned. Many surviving forms are associated with colder waters, greater depths, or environments removed from the shallow marine habitats where their distant relatives once flourished. These settings resemble the kinds of refuges that can buffer organisms from some environmental extremes. Their present distribution is therefore partly an inheritance, shaped by extinction, survival, competition, and everything that followed. Other traces are carried inside physiology rather than sediment. Bivalves possess forms of metabolic flexibility that allow many species to endure fluctuations in oxygen, availability, and other environmental stresses better than more specialized organisms. Sea urchins and related survivors likewise descend from lineages that passed through severe episodes of environmental disruption. These traits were not designed for a single catastrophe, nor were they preserved unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Evolution continued reshaping every lineage. Yet, survival determined which ancestral toolkits remained available for evolution to modify. Modern oxygen-depleted waters provide another connection between present observation and ancient chemistry. The Black Sea contains deep waters where oxygen is absent and hydrogen sulfide accumulates, creating conditions in which most familiar marine animals cannot persist. Parts of the Arabian Sea also experience severe oxygen depletion, while seasonal dead zones develop in the Gulf of Mexico as microbial decomposition consumes dissolved oxygen. None is a complete recreation of the Permian Ocean, but each allows researchers to examine processes that become important when circulation, temperature, nutrient supply, and biological decay combine to remove oxygen from seawater. Within such environments, microbial communities replace many oxygen-dependent organisms. Chemical boundaries form through the water column, and the cycling of sulfur, carbon, and nitrogen changes. By studying these processes directly, scientists gain a clearer understanding of signals preserved in ancient sediments. Modern environments become laboratories for interpreting rocks, while rocks provide a longer perspective on conditions observed today. The connection between those worlds is therefore neither a surviving body of ancient seawater nor an untouched biological relic. It is continuity written through consequence. An extinction altered which lineages remained, where their descendants could persist, and which ecological possibilities were available afterward. Geological layers retained the chemistry of the disruption, while evolution carried selected traits onward through surviving branches. The ocean has circulated, continents have moved, and entire ecosystems have arisen since then. Still, beneath those transformations lies an inheritance that was never erased. The great dying remains present, not as the ancient ocean itself, but as a pattern impressed upon everything that survived it. Across the abyssal plain, absence has no visible outline. Sediment settles over it, currents pass above it, and later, organisms cross the same ground without knowing what once occupied the space beneath them. Yet ecology can preserve vacancies long after their original inhabitants disappear. Scientists sometimes describe ghost ranges, intervals, or places where evidence suggests a lineage should have existed, even when its fossils are missing. On a broader imaginative scale, extinction leaves another kind of ghost, an ecological position whose former occupant will never return. The Permian seas created such absences across much of the planet. Continental shelves once covered by dense communities of brachiopods became available to entirely different descendants. Reef surfaces, shaped by rugose and tabulate corals, lost the organisms that had determined their architecture. Seafloors crossed by trilobites for roughly 270 million years continued to exist after the last trilobite vanished, but the ancient relationship between animal and habitat had ended. The physical space remained, its biological meaning had changed. Over succeeding ages, life entered those openings. New shellfish spread across marine bottoms. Different reef builders raised complex structures into sunlit water. Crustaceans and other arthropods diversified into roles that overlapped with portions of older ecological territory. Predators evolved around unfamiliar prey, while prey developed defenses against predators that no Permian animal had encountered. The vacancies did not remain empty forever, but neither were they restored to an earlier state. Each occupation altered the space again, placing a new ecological history over the remains of the old one. This distinction becomes visible when machines descend into the modern deep ocean. Remotely operated vehicles move above abyssal plains where delicate animals emerge from fine sediment. They climb seamount slopes inhabited by sponges and corals adapted to cold water, then pass communities sustained by particles descending from productive waters far overhead. Every organism belongs to a living system with its own intricate relationships, yet the evolutionary pathways leading to these scenes passed through the narrow filter of the end Permian extinction. The inhabitants are therefore descendants of continuity interrupted. Their ancestors survived directly, or emerged from branches that persisted because other branches disappeared. Even lineages that originated much later evolved within ecological landscapes already transformed by the catastrophe. The available niches, competitors, predators, and opportunities had all been rearranged before they appeared. Seen across geological time, recovery becomes less like rebuilding a fallen structure and more like writing over a surface whose earlier markings can never be fully removed. New complexity accumulates, but it follows new directions. A modern coral garden may possess extraordinary diversity without reproducing any Paleozoic community. An abyssal ecosystem may contain elaborate networks of feeding and dependence, yet none can restore the exact interactions erased at the boundary. The fossil record preserves only fragments of those missing arrangements. Shells reveal where some animals lived. Burrows record movement through sediment. Reef limestone captures the shapes created by vanished builders. Trace fossils preserve moments of behavior without preserving the animal itself. From these remains, paleontologists reconstruct portions of ecosystems whose complete texture is inaccessible, because most biological relationships leave no durable fossil at all. What survives is enough to show that the loss extended beyond bodies. Entire patterns of occupation disappeared from marine space. Places remained geographically present while becoming ecologically new. Today's deep ocean is ancient in its physical foundations, but its living communities belong to histories shaped by catastrophe and renewal. Beneath miles of water, the seafloor carries no visible boundary separating what endured from what vanished. Life simply continues across it, generation after generation, building complexity from whatever inheritance survived. The spaces once occupied by the Permian world have long since been filled. Their original inhabitants remain absent. In that difference lies the enduring shape of extinction, not an empty ocean, but a living one whose fullness can never contain everything it once knew. A geologist can cross one of the greatest biological ruptures in Earth history with the movement of a hand. In exposed marine rocks scattered across the world, layers deposited before the end, Permian extinction lie directly beneath layers formed after it. The distance between them may be remarkably small, yet the biological difference preserved across that interval spans an entire transformation of the planet. In the mountains of southern China, the limestone succession at Meishan has become the internationally recognized reference for the Permian-Triassic boundary. Other records appear in northern Italy, Greenland, and the rocks of the United Arab Emirates. Each site formed under its own local conditions, but together they preserve variations of the same global disturbance. Their sediments contain chemical changes, fossil disappearances, and mineral evidence that allow researchers to align events separated today by thousands of miles. Below the boundary, Paleozoic marine life appears in abundance. Brachiopod shells accumulate within limestone. Corals and crinoids record communities built through long intervals of ecological stability. Ammonoids preserve the remains of animals that once moved through the water column, while the final representatives of trilobite lineages occur before their disappearance from the record. The fossils are not evenly distributed everywhere, nor does every location preserve every group, but the collective pattern reveals ecosystems containing many forms and ecological roles. Then, the record changes. At some sites, the transition includes dark sediment enriched in organic material. Elsewhere, unusual minerals and shifts in elemental chemistry indicate changing oxygen conditions. Carbon isotopes show a pronounced disturbance to the carbon cycle, while fossil assemblages contract sharply. Layers that once contained diverse remains give way to deposits dominated by far fewer organisms. Small bivalves and gastropods become conspicuous among the survivors, and microbial structures appear in settings where more complex communities had previously shaped the substrate. The rock does not preserve the catastrophe as a single universal layer, identical in every location. Sedimentation rates differed from basin to basin. Some sequences contain gaps caused by erosion or periods when little sediment accumulated. Others preserve the transition with exceptional detail. Geologists therefore compare many sections using fossils, isotopic signals, volcanic ash beds, and radiometric dating to assemble a chronology from records that are incomplete individually but powerful when read together. This is what makes the Permian-Triassic boundary more than a marker between geological periods. It is a natural archive of a planetary system under extraordinary pressure. Within its layers, researchers can trace changes in the carbon cycle alongside evidence for warming, acidification, disrupted productivity, and declining oxygen. The sequence allows causes and consequences to be placed into time, revealing how disturbances move through interconnected parts of the Earth system. Standing beside such an exposure compresses an immense interval into something physically immediate. One layer belongs to seas governed by ecological relationships established across the Paleozoic era. Another belongs to the altered world that followed. Between them lies evidence of a transition whose full duration was brief by geological standards, but far longer than any human lifetime. A hand placed against the rock cannot touch every lost species or recover the vanished relationships between them. What it touches is their remaining archive, mineral grains, and fossil fragments arranged in the order they settled. Water continually circulates. Ocean basins open and close. Continents migrate. Sediments are buried. Mountains rise, and ancient seafloors can eventually stand beneath open sky. Through those transformations, portions of the record endure. The extinction survives there as chemistry, texture, absence, and stone. Long after the Permian seas themselves disappeared, their final changes remained written into the planet, waiting within cliffs and mountains for another species, hundreds of millions of years later, to learn how to read them. Life at the end of the Permian existed one body at a time. Beneath the immense patterns reconstructed from fossils and chemistry were individual animals responding to the immediate world around them. A brachiopod opened and closed its valves as water passed across its feeding structures. An ammonoid adjusted its movement through the water. A trilobite sensed its surroundings through compound eyes and chemical cues, crossed the sediment, searched for food, avoided danger, and continued a lineage older than almost every familiar group of animals alive today. For roughly 270 million years, trilobites had persisted through changing continents, shifting climates, and earlier extinction events. No individual experienced that span. Each inhabited only a tiny fraction of it, born into conditions inherited from generations before. The continuity existed not within any single animal but in reproduction, one generation following another, carrying an ancient body plan through geological time. The final crisis disrupted that continuity gradually enough that its progression would have been invisible to any creature living through a single lifespan. Water warmed. Oxygen became harder to obtain. Increasing acidity placed additional strain on organisms that built mineralized shells and skeletons. These changes unfolded unevenly across marine environments, creating temporary refuges in some places while making others increasingly difficult to inhabit. An animal could still feed, reproduce, and leave offspring even as the larger conditions supporting its lineage moved steadily toward a threshold. Extinction operates across that difference in scale. What seems abrupt in a column of rock may encompass thousands of generations. Within those generations, there need not be a recognizable final day. Only declining populations, shrinking ranges, failed reproduction, disrupted food webs, and fewer descendants returning to places their ancestors once occupied. Each local disappearance removes another thread until a lineage that had crossed entire geological periods survives nowhere. Somewhere in the late Permian world, the final trilobite lived without knowing that it was final. Its surroundings contained no announcement of an ending. The water around it was simply the water available to breathe and move through, altered by forces originating far beyond anything an animal could perceive. Perhaps others of its kind had already vanished from distant seas. Perhaps its population had been declining for generations. Eventually, one individual died without producing the continuation upon which 270 million years of persistence had depended. Nothing in the ocean marked that instant. The same process reached countless other lineages. Entire branches of evolutionary history narrowed toward their final organisms, each death biologically ordinary, even when its cumulative meaning was extraordinary. Predation continued where predators remained. Animals searched for mates where mates could still be found. Larvae entered currents that increasingly carried them into unsuitable habitats. Shells settled onto sediment beside the remains of earlier generations, while ecological relationships assembled over immense spans of time came apart through countless individual failures to continue. Fossils preserve only fragments of those lives. A shell records structure, not experience. A trackway captures movement without revealing its purpose. A burrow remains after the animal that made it has disappeared. From such traces, paleontologists reconstruct populations and ecosystems. Yet beneath every statistical curve of declining diversity lies the simpler biological reality that living organisms stopped leaving descendants. Afterward, the ocean continued circulating around continents. Tides rose and withdrew. Currents crossed empty ranges and carried surviving larvae into newly vacant habitats. Life did not pause beside what had vanished, and evolution kept working with whatever remained. Over time, sediment covered the final shells. Minerals entered buried remains, rock formed around them, and continents carried portions of ancient seafloor into mountains. The living world moved onward, diminished but unfinished. The lost remained behind as shapes in stone. Each fossil, the physical trace of an animal that once occupied its own brief moment in an ocean where continuation had always seemed possible, until, generation by generation, it no longer was. Survival, at the scale of a planet, can be almost invisible. It may reside in a scattered population, sheltered along a coastline, in larvae carried toward tolerable water, or in organisms whose metabolisms can endure conditions that eliminate more specialized neighbors. After the greatest biological crisis of the age, enough such threads remained unbroken for evolution to continue weaving. Those survivors represented only a fraction of the richness that had existed before them. Their persistence did not preserve the former ocean intact, nor did it restore what disappeared. Entire evolutionary histories had already reached their ends. Ecological relationships assembled across hundreds of millions of years could not simply reappear when conditions improved. What remained was something more fundamental: living populations capable of feeding, reproducing, varying, and passing inherited traits into an uncertain world. From this narrow inheritance, complexity accumulated again. Generation followed generation. Mutations introduced variation. Natural selection favored forms suited to emerging conditions, while changing environments opened possibilities that had not existed before the extinction. Descendants spread into vacant habitats and divided into new lineages. Some experiments disappeared almost as soon as they arose. Others persisted, diversified, and became foundations for communities unlike anything the Permian seas had contained. The process required immense stretches of time. Roughly 50 million years passed before marine ecosystems recovered a comparable degree of complexity, a span long enough for continents to shift and entire evolutionary radiations to unfold. Survival, therefore, was not rescue. The approximately 96% of marine species that vanished were not waiting to return. 300 million years of accumulated biological history could not be reconstructed from memory. Evolution could move onward only with the organisms still alive. Yet within those survivors remained the machinery from which biological possibility emerges. Cells continued transforming energy. Genetic information continued passing between generations. Populations continued changing as environments filtered variation. Predators and prey formed new relationships. Competition reshaped communities. Symbioses developed between organisms whose distant ancestors might never have encountered one another. Given enough generations, simple communities became layered food webs, and empty ecological space acquired inhabitants. This persistence reveals life less as a permanent collection of creatures than as an ongoing process. Species are temporary expressions within it. Ecosystems assemble, endure, change, and sometimes disappear. Even the identities of dominant groups can shift so completely that an ocean separated from another by geological time may seem almost foreign, despite both arising from the same continuous history of living chemistry. The ocean itself belongs to that continuity without remaining fixed. Its inhabitants before the Great Dying formed one arrangement. The survivors and their descendants produced another. Today's marine world is another configuration still, temporary on the scale of deep time, filled with organisms whose present abundance reflects both ancient catastrophe and every evolutionary opportunity that followed. Life has persisted on Earth for at least 3.5 billion years through changes in atmosphere, climate, continents, and ocean chemistry that repeatedly transformed the conditions under which organisms could exist. Persistence across such time does not mean invulnerability. Continuity can contain losses so complete that nothing resembling the vanished lineage ever appears again. The survival of life as a planetary phenomenon does not preserve the individual forms through which life happens. That distinction gives the Great Dying its deepest scale. Life continued, but almost everything familiar to the Permian Ocean did not. What crossed the boundary was a reduced inheritance, enough to keep biological processes moving while the world around them changed. From those fragments came unfamiliar seas, new architectures, new bodies, and new relationships. The continuity lay not in restoring what had been, but in the ability of living systems to keep becoming. The ocean, in this sense, has never been a finished thing. Across billions of years, it has remained an unfolding biological event, carrying life through one temporary arrangement after another. The Great Dying removed nearly an entire world from that unfolding, yet the process itself endured, diminished beyond recognition, still capable of beginning again from whatever remained. Across most of the planet tonight, there is water. It lies beneath moonlight and cloud, beneath storms and clear skies, stretching beyond coastlines until the curvature of Earth hides the horizon. Covering about 71% of the surface, the ocean seems permanent from a human perspective, a feature so vast that it can appear almost timeless. Yet the living system within that water belongs to a particular chapter of Earth history, shaped by an ancient rupture whose consequences never entirely disappeared. The modern ocean is not the Permian Ocean carried unchanged into the present. Its communities, food webs, reefs, and dominant animals were assembled after the greatest extinction known from the fossil record. 252 million years of evolution separate today's marine world from that boundary, but nearly everything now, swimming, crawling, drifting, or growing beneath the surface, belongs to lineages filtered through it. Even the movement of seawater occurs within a planetary arrangement profoundly different from the one that preceded the catastrophe. The Atlantic Ocean did not yet exist during the Permian, and today's continents had not reached their present positions. Modern circulation systems emerged as tectonic plates rearranged the geography of ocean basins. Dense water now sinks in high latitudes. Deep currents connect distant basins. The Antarctic circumpolar current flows around an isolated southern continent, and great gyres turn across the Pacific and Atlantic. These patterns belong to the world that developed long after the ancient stagnation had passed. Within them, life occupies almost every available depth. Sunlit surface waters support microscopic photosynthetic organisms that form the foundation of vast food webs and contribute a major share of the oxygen released by biological activity on Earth. Far below, where sunlight cannot penetrate, animals depend on organic material descending from above, on predation, or, in specialized habitats, on chemical energy emerging from Earth's crust. Between these realms lies an immense vertical landscape of migration, feeding, reproduction, and survival. Every inhabitant belongs to the aftermath. A fish crossing open water carries an evolutionary history shaped by opportunities created after older communities vanished. A clam buried beneath coastal sediment belongs to a group whose expansion followed the decline of competitors that once dominated ancient seafloors. Reef organisms inhabit structures assembled by evolutionary partnerships that arose in a world already transformed. The present ocean is therefore both living environment and historical consequence, its abundance built upon a biological foundation that catastrophe once reduced to fragments. Somewhere in colder water, a brachiopod may still extend its feeding structure into the current. Its lineage reaches far beyond the extinction boundary, back toward seas in which relatives were among the most familiar animals on the bottom. Today, surviving brachiopods are far less dominant, often occupying environments where colder temperatures and deeper settings provide conditions different from the shallow marine habitats their distant relatives once filled so extensively. There is no awareness within that animal of the history carried by its lineage. It responds only to its surroundings, drawing food from passing water and maintaining the ordinary biological work of remaining alive. Yet its existence connects two radically different versions of marine Earth, not through an unchanged ecosystem, but through ancestry. Above it, currents continue their long paths. Nutrients rise and sink. Oxygen enters surface waters and is carried into deeper layers. Carbon moves between atmosphere, organisms, sediments, and seawater. The machinery of the modern ocean operates continuously, regulating climate and supporting a planetary biosphere whose structure would have been unfamiliar before the Great Dying. 252 million years can seem sufficient to erase any catastrophe. On geological scales, however, extinction does not vanish merely because diversity returns. Evolution rebuilds without reversing. Each new community inherits the conditions left by the one before it, and every surviving lineage carries possibilities constrained by what endured. So the ocean tonight is ancient without being unchanged. Beneath its familiar surface lies a world assembled after loss, altered repeatedly by evolution, tectonics, climate, and time. Its creatures inhabit neither the original ocean nor a restored version of it. They inhabit the latest arrangement of something still unfolding, a living sea whose deepest history is carried not only in stone, but in the bodies moving through its water now. A boundary can be thinner than the history it divides. In exposed marine rocks from the end of the Permian, layers accumulated before the extinction meet sediments deposited after it, preserving a transition that can be traced across widely separated parts of the world. The details vary from place to place, yet the change recorded within them is unmistakable. Fossil abundance collapses, carbon chemistry shifts. Evidence of environmental stress gathers around a geological horizon, marking one of the sharpest biological divisions in Earth history. Beneath that boundary lies an ocean whose communities belonged to a world with no living equivalent. Its animals had inherited evolutionary histories extending through much of the Paleozoic era. Brachiopods crowded favorable seafloors, Crinoids raised feeding structures into passing water. Trilobites occupied habitats shaped by lineages already ancient before the Permian began. Reef communities were constructed by organisms whose architectures disappeared with them. Their fossils occur together because, while alive, their ecological relationships existed together, woven into environments assembled over immense intervals of time. Then the record changes. Approximately 252 million years ago, the continuity of those communities broke. The extinction did not remove every organism, nor did it sterilize the planet, but it ended enough lineages to alter the direction of marine evolution permanently. Above the boundary, survivors and opportunistic forms entered a world with ecological space newly opened around them. Later, descendants diversified into roles once occupied by unrelated animals. New reef builders eventually constructed different structures. New predators moved through the water. Familiar biological functions returned, but the organisms performing them had changed. Stone preserves the distinction with a clarity that living ecosystems cannot. Evolution continually modifies what survives, obscuring ancient transitions beneath layers of descent and adaptation. Rock does something different. It keeps sequences in place. A fossil below a boundary remains below it. A chemical anomaly deposited during environmental disruption remains locked within minerals. Sediment becomes an archive in which events separated by millions of years can eventually lie inches apart. This compression gives the extinction boundary its peculiar scale. A hand placed across such layers can span geological time that no human mind experiences directly. On one side lies the accumulated history of communities approaching their final appearance. On the other lies the beginning of an ecological world assembled from what remained. Between them is not an empty interval, but evidence of profound planetary change recorded through isotopes, minerals, sediments, and the sudden disappearance of familiar fossils. The Permian Ocean itself cannot be visited anywhere on Earth. No hidden basin preserves it intact. Its reefs are no longer functioning ecosystems, and its vanished lineages are not waiting in unexplored depths. What remains are physical traces, shells mineralized in limestone, impressions pressed into ancient sediment, chemical signatures left by altered seawater, and the absence that begins where once abundant fossils cease to appear. Yet disappearance did not stop biological time. The ocean continued receiving sunlight, exchanging gases with the atmosphere, moving heat around the planet, and carrying surviving organisms through changing environments. Life expanded again, but it did so without reversing the extinction. Every later ecosystem developed from the inheritance available above that boundary, not from the world preserved below it. The modern sea is therefore separated from the Permian by more than 250 million years of evolution, but also connected to it by consequence. Its inhabitants descend from lineages that passed through the crisis. Its ecological structures arose within opportunities created by loss. Even its familiar abundance belongs to a history whose direction was altered when an older marine world ended. Far beneath present waves, sediments continue accumulating grain by grain. Today's oceans are also leaving records, preserving chemistry, biological remains, and traces of environmental change for whatever distant future may eventually expose them. The ancient boundary offers no voice and no intention. It simply remains where geology placed it, a narrow division between worlds. Below lies an ocean completed forever. Above lies everything that followed, including the water covering Earth tonight, filled with descendants of the fraction that endured and shaped by possibilities opened when so much else disappeared. Life continued because continuation was still possible. The stone records how narrow that possibility became.